Hi, this is Dr. Gregory Sadler. I'm a professor of philosophy and the president and founder of an educational consulting company called Reason.io, where we put philosophy into practice. I've studied and taught philosophy for over 20 years, and I find that many people run into difficulties reading classic philosophical texts. Sometimes it's the way things are said or how the text is structured. But the concepts themselves are not always that complicated, and that's where I come in. To help students and lifelong learners, I've been producing longer lecture videos and posting them to YouTube. Many viewers say they find them useful. What you're currently watching is part of a new series of shorter videos, each of them focused on one core concept from an important philosophical text. I hope you find it useful as well. In the second main part of the Myth of Sisyphus, Albert Camus is going to set out a number of important ethical reflections, and this is titled The Absurd Man. It's not the human being, him or herself, who is absurd. This is the person who encounters the absurd. And let's remind ourselves that it's not the world itself that's absurd and then the person just has to live in it. Rather, for Albert Camus, the absurd is this triadic relation between the world, the human being, and the divorce, as he calls it, between them. A divorce between our desires and rationality and then what it is that we actually encounter in the world, and not just a world of objects or natural laws, but a world of other people as well. And so what can he tell us about the absurd person? He calls them he who, without negating it, does nothing for the eternal. And what an interesting way to frame this, right? It's not saying, well, there is no eternal whatsoever, but the eternal kind of doesn't matter to the person who is, encountering and sustaining that encounter with the absurd. Instead, what marks the absurd person? So he tells us that they prefer courage and reasoning to nostalgia. Now, this is an actual orientation or choice. They don't have to prefer that. They could lapse back into nostalgia. They could take, as he's going to call it in this section a little bit later, and as he's called it earlier, the leap to go away from the recognition of the absurd. Instead, they choose courage. And what does courage mean in this case? Living without appeal, something we've seen talked about quite a bit in the earlier sections, and then getting along with, sufficing, suffice, right, with what one actually has. Now, this is not just about property or living, on your income or something like that. This is ontologically living with what you actually have in the present and the immediate future that you can envision, not putting things off to some distant past, right? Or present or future, right? So he goes on and he says, reasoning. What is the reasoning? It informs him, it literally teaches him, instruir is the term, of his limits. What are these limits? Assured of his temporally limited freedom, the freedom that we actually do have exists, but it is restrictive. We only have the freedom that we have at any given point in time. It's not like you can bank it. It's not like you can, save it up for later on or anything like that. And if you don't use it, you lose it. His revolt devoid of future, his mortal consciousness, right? These are the things that reasoning for the absurd man reveals. He says he lives out his adventure within the span of his lifetime. You're not going to get another life. You're going to get this right here, and you can say, well, this sucks. It's not long enough. I'm not living in the right place. Circumstances aren't giving me the range of freedom I want. Too bad. You get what you get. And this is it. So he says that is his field, that is his action, which he shields from any judgment other than his own. A greater life cannot mean for him another life. You can only live the life that you actually have. And some sort of greater life that you envision is really just an imagination. And if you're going to throw yourself into that, you are, in a certain sense, failing yourself, as Camus is going to say a little bit later. And he says, I'm not even talking about that paltry eternity that is called posterity. So, we have eternity sort of like, living in heaven or hell or some other way in which we would live forever. That's foreclosed for Camus. He doesn't say, well, I definitely know that's not the case. He just says, I have no reason to think that's the case. And it's the same thing for our legacy, for posterity, for what it is that we're going to leave behind. We don't control that. That's up to other people. We could be, completely forgotten once our obituary has been published, our body has been disposed of in whatever way. Everybody's gathered together to say, ooh, what a great person this was. Then they move on with their lives. And then we're gone. Right? So we'd better focus on the life that we have in front of us. And then he says, I'm not going to hold forth, literally, make a dissertation on ethics. He says, I've seen people behave badly with great morality, and I note every day integrity has no need of rules. Now, we should pause on that for a moment. So Camus is going to say, you don't get rules, règles, right, for real ethics. But does that mean that you couldn't possibly ever have any sort of rules? No, that would be up to you, but you need to think through the rules that you're going to impose on yourself, not just grab them out of some textbook or, God gave them to you or the person down the street told you Kantian morality. No, you're going to have to figure them out yourself. And so he says, there is but one moral code that the absurd man can accept, the one that is not separated from God, the one that is dictated. But it so happens he lives outside of that God. So you can't accept that. What about shifting to the other side and becoming what he calls an immoralist? Now, this was a tradition, particularly within French literature, philosophy at the time, of saying, we need to reject morality. We're going to shift to the other extreme, and we're going to deliberately subvert it. We're going to find other values to work with. And Camus says, well, that's kind of making a leap as well. He says, the absurd man sees nothing in them, the immoralists, but justifications, and they don't have to justify anything, not to others. So he says, we're going to start from the principle of innocence. Now, does he mean innocence like, I've never done anything wrong or anything like that? No. But he's got this very interesting reflection on what would it mean to take transcendent values, particularly God, out of the picture. So he says, everything is permitted, exclaims Ivan Karamazov. This is in Dostoevsky's The Brothers Karamazov. Is there an exact quote? Not exactly, but it's close enough. That too smacks of the absurd, but on condition it not be taken in the vulgar sense. So Camus says, you've got to think carefully about what this everything is permitted actually means. He says, it's not an outburst of relief or joy, two emotional states that you would expect, right? Everything is permitted. I don't have to put up with all these silly rules that people have been imposing on me, telling me that they're coming from God. Oh, what a relief. Or even joy, sort of like that famous, now at this point, meme of the guy who's, in the whatever it is, club, discotheque, something like that, and he has a conversation with a female reporter who is talking with him about, morality, and she reveals to him that, there is no God, sort of a Nietzschean perspective. You can do anything you want, and he starts dancing like this. So Camus is saying, no, that is not what the absurd person is going to say, finding out that everything is permitted. It's a bitter acknowledgement of a fact. Why? The certainty of a God giving a meaning to life surpasses in attractiveness the ability to behave badly with impunity. The choice would not be hard to make. If there was a God who we could rely on for this, take the God. That's better than just like anybody does whatever the hell they want and there's no meaning whatsoever to anything and we just prey on each other. Take that option. But that's not really available for the absurd person. And he says the absurd does not liberate, instead it binds. Now, there's a bit that we need to explain here that makes sense of this. Why does the absurd bind? It seems like if everything is absurd, then nothing has to make sense. You can do whatever the hell you want. You can follow out your instincts. You can jump into some sort of religious or philosophical life stance that is supposed to be transcendent. Why not choose that? Camus says, well, that's not really going to work for you. Why? Because what binds is not just the absurd itself, it's you. You bind yourself, but not in a Kantian way where, you are the subject giving rules to itself and to others within a kingdom of ends or something like that. No, you're on your own. But you do have the capacity to choose. And one of the things that you can choose that Camus is actually advocating here is consistency. He's been advocating that from the very beginning of the work. So he says, the absurd does not authorize all actions. Everything is permitted does not mean that nothing is forbidden. The absurd only confers an equivalence on the consequences of those actions. It doesn't recommend crime. This would be childish, but it restores to remorse its futility. Likewise, if all experiences are indifferent, then that of duty is legitimate as any other. You can be virtuous through a whim. And then he says, when we think about all systems of morality, they're based on the idea that an action has consequences that either legitimate or cancel, obliterate those actions, right? And they don't. The consequences don't change the action in that sense, but they tell you that the action was the wrong one in some respect, right? So he says that a mind imbued with the absurd merely judges that those consequences must be considered calmly. It is prepared to pay up. It is prepared to take responsibility for the actions, for the consequences, even if the consequences were not what you foresaw or intended. They came from your action. Consequences for yourself, consequences for others, consequences for this absurd, crazy, not conforming to our ideas world, right? So this is quite interesting. He's not saying you can't have any system of morality. Obviously, they're all going to be essentially chosen, but there's something that's really quite important. Actions and consequences connected with each other. Just invoking the absurd doesn't change that. So he goes on and he says, there may be responsible persons, but there are no guilty ones. And he says, at the very most, a mind like this will consent to use past experience as a basis for its future actions, right? And so then he says, well, what rule could we get from this unreasonable order of life, right? And he says, the only truth that might seem instructive to him is not formal. Instead, the truth is one that comes to life. It lives itself, you could say, and unfolds or unrolls itself, se déroule, in human beings. So as opposed to having rules and some sort of system and then human beings afterwards and the rules apply to them and tell them whether they're good or bad or stuff like that, what we need is something that develops within human lives. And it doesn't mean that it ceases being intelligible or it's purely subjective. We can talk about these things, but we can't completely universalize or systematize them, he's going to say. And so he talks about the absurd mind not expecting ethical rules at the end of its reasoning as instead illustrations and the breadth of human lives. And he says, the few following images are of this type. They prolong the absurd reasoning by giving it a specific attitude. And then he's also going to call these examples. A bit later in the work, he'll call these sketches, dessins, right? Designs, literally, of these sorts of things. And who is he going to talk about? Well, he brings up three and analyzes them at length. And we're going to skip over that here, just talking about the general, and then look at each of these separately elsewhere. So there's Don Juanism, as he calls it, and that's a little hard for us probably in the present to relate to. You've got to think about the legends about Don Juan, where he's not just this lover who, loves him and leaves him. What is his motivation? What is he really about? He is seeking something out within this lifespan through the act of seduction, love, and then moving on to the next person. The next one that Camus is going to talk about under the heading drama is the actor. And he says, this is, in some respects, the absurd person par excellence, because whatever reality is that the actor is impersonating basically only exists for 2 hours or so, however long that character is on the stage. And so that is, a pretty important reflection. And then we get conquest, the adventurer, or as he's going to call him, the conqueror, the person who is taking a bite out of life, right? Imposing some order, some structure, whatever it happens to be, onto this world, knowing full well that whatever it is that they're able to accomplish is going to crumble. It's going to go away. In a way, it is ephemeral, like the love acts of the lover or the portrayal of the actor, even if it seems to be written in things that are more lasting, like stone and social systems and laws and all of that sort of stuff. And he's going to look at these three. He says, I choose people who only aim to expend themselves or who I see to be expending themselves. And that has no further implication. For the moment, I want to speak only of a world in which thoughts, like lives, are devoid of a future. Everything that makes man work and get excited utilizes hope. And so I want to look at three types that are not relying upon hope, but staring, we could say, reality in its disappointing, ugly face, right? And then when he concludes this, he says, by the way, these are just three possibilities. I could have chosen many others. And interestingly, look at the examples of those who he says he could have focused on. The chaste man, the person who's not having sexual, conquest after conquest like Don Juan, but actually reserving their sexuality either for one partner or no partners whatsoever. They could be just as equally living out absurd existence as Don Juan. The civil servant. Now, is this opposed to the actor in quite the same way? No, you could say, well, the civil servant is dealing with a world that's not quite so bright and flashy and ephemeral as that of the actor. But, that's not the only line of distinction or division between them. And then we get the president of the republic. Is that opposed to the adventurer? Maybe, maybe not. Kind of depends on what kind of president we're talking about. Some presidents may have been adventurers, right, of sorts. And each of these is a possibility. We could also think of those that Camus himself doesn't signify here. The janitor who works at their job in a giant office complex year after year to provide an income to send their child off to college. a life that they didn't have. Could that be done in a way that is consequent to the absurd person? Yes, right? And so he's going to go into this very interesting discussion at the end of this section about the absurd person. And he says that it's enough for any of them to know and to mask nothing. And so he says, the leap in all of its forms, rushing into the divine or the eternal, surrendering to the illusions of the everyday or the idea, these screens hide the absurd from us. But you can find civil servants, people working in the Department of Motor Vehicles, for example, who are not putting up that screen. And they are the ones who I mean to speak of. And he says, I have chosen the most extreme ones, and at this level the absurd gives them a royal power. Now, this royal power itself is also marked by absurdity. It's not just coming from absurdity. He calls them princes without kingdoms. Okay, so they're nobility, they're kind of better in some respect than everybody else, or more elevated. And yet, he goes on to say, they have this advantage over others. They know that all royalties are illusory. They know it is their whole nobility, and it is useless to speak in relation to them of hidden misfortune or the ashes of disillusion. So, yes, they're royalty, but royalty means nothing, and that is their distinction. He's also got this great line about what it is that they're trying to do. And this is very, typically Camusian, we could say. They're not striving to be better, meilleur. And so this could be understood in two ways. They're not striving to be better than everybody else. They're not striving to be better than themselves. They don't have a scale of values that they can say, aha, I've moved from this point to this point. What are they striving after? Something different that's more basic. To be, as we translate it, consistent, conséquent, to be somebody who has, relatively few outright contradictions between their actions and their intentions and their views on it and the outcomes or consequences that happen or the general structure of their life. And you might say, well, why should I be consistent? If the whole place is screwy, doesn't make sense, why can't I just do whatever the hell I want? And Camus would say, you can. Nobody's stopping you, man. But this is something that is central to human beings. The recognition that there is a value to consistency. And this is very basic. So, Camus is perfectly fine with saying, you may not recognize that. I'm not going to force it on you, but I'm going to tell you that being consistent is something that these people are, in fact, seeking out. He also brings up another really interesting line. He says that they are deprived of hope, but that doesn't mean that they are despairing. Right? And, the French for this espoir is hope, désespoir is despair. So, the two of them are not equivalent. To be sans espoir is not the same thing as désespoir, So this is an important point as well. You don't have to slip into it all sucks, nothing's any good. That's not really the face of the person in the absurd, right? They have a kind of ethics, but it's an ethics of working things out for themselves, and they don't need hope in order to do that. He's going to finish up at the very end by invoking one other interesting idea. He tells us that the imagination can add many other examples, inseparable from time and exile, who know what? They know how to live in harmony with a universe without future and without weakness. Faiblesse. It's not the universe that's lacking weakness in this case. It is the person themselves. And this has to do with their striving, not just, thinking that it's good, but actually trying to be consistent. That is how they show that courage. That is how they follow out that reasoning. So what do we have here? Do we have an actual ethics? We don't have a set of rules or a systematization. We do, in fact, though, have some very interesting ethical reflections and some sketches of what it would be like to take the absurd seriously and not try to evade or avoid it by leaping into hope or by lapsing into nihilistic despair. And so these offer us a glimpse into something like a Camusian ethics.